March 1945. Night falls over Tokyo. The city is dark by design. Streetlights are extinguished, windows are covered. Families sit quietly inside wooden homes built close together along narrow streets. In the distance, somewhere beyond the black horizon, a low mechanical hum begins to grow. At first it is faint. Many residents freeze in silence, listening. They know that sound now. It is the distant drone of engines from the massive Boeing B-29 Superfortress, aircraft so large that Japanese fighters struggle to reach them. The bombers fly from distant Pacific islands, controlled by the United States Army Air Forces. Then the air raid sirens begin. Across the neighborhoods, people move quickly but quietly. Mothers gather children. Elderly residents step toward shelters. Buckets of water and sand are positioned beside doorways in case fires start. Overhead, searchlights sweep across the sky. The engines grow louder. For many civilians, the fear is no longer just the bombs. It is the realization that these aircraft are no longer rare visitors. They return again and again and again, night after night. The war has come directly to the cities of Japan, and to understand why those engines began returning so relentlessly, we must look back at how the Pacific War slowly brought American bombers within reach of the Japanese homeland. By the beginning of 1945, the war in the Pacific had been raging for more than 3 years. The conflict that began with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had spread across thousands of miles of ocean and dozens of islands. At first, Japan appeared unstoppable. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific in the months after Pearl Harbor. They captured strategic territories including Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. The victories were rapid and shocking. For the leaders of the United States Army Air Forces, the problem was clear. Japan's empire stretched across the Pacific, but the Japanese homeland itself remained far beyond the range of American bombers. The war could be fought on islands and seas, but striking the heart of Japan was another matter entirely. Early in the war, American planners believed strategic bombing could play a decisive role. In Europe, American heavy bombers such as the Boeing B-29 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were already attacking German industry. But Japan posed a very different challenge. The distances were enormous. From the nearest Allied bases in the Pacific, the Japanese mainland was often thousands of miles away. No existing American bomber had the range to strike Japan and return safely. To solve this problem, American engineers began developing a completely new aircraft. The result was the enormous Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It was one of the most technologically advanced aircraft of the entire war. The bomber had pressurized crew compartments, remote-controlled gun turrets, and engines powerful enough to lift massive bomb loads across vast distances. With a range exceeding 3,000 miles, it was designed specifically for long-range strategic bombing. But building the aircraft was only the first step. The United States also needed bases close enough to Japan to launch these bombers. One early attempt involved using airfields in China. Under a complex supply system known as Operation Matterhorn, B-29 bombers flew from bases in India and staged through Chinese airfields to strike targets in Japan. The operation was incredibly difficult. Fuel, bombs, and spare parts had to be flown over the towering mountains of the Himalayas in dangerous transport missions known simply as the hump. Every gallon of fuel required enormous effort to deliver. Despite the difficulty, the first B-29 raid against the Japanese home islands finally occurred on June 15, 1944, targeting the steelworks at Yawata. The results were limited. Cloud cover, mechanical problems, and the sheer complexity of the mission meant the bombing was far less effective than American planners hoped. Worse still, the logistics of Operation Matterhorn made sustained bombing campaigns almost impossible. But while these early missions struggled, events elsewhere in the Pacific were changing the strategic situation. American forces had begun pushing steadily across the Pacific in a campaign often called island hopping. One by one, key islands were captured from Japanese control, bringing American airfields closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Battles such as the Battle of Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Philippine Sea weakened Japanese power in the region. But the most important objective lay further north. A chain of islands in the Central Pacific known as the Mariana Islands. These islands were not simply another battlefield. Their location made them strategically priceless. From the Marianas, long-range bombers could reach nearly every major industrial city in Japan. Capturing them would transform the air war completely. In the summer of 1944, American forces launched massive amphibious assaults across the Marianas. The battles that followed were brutal, fought on beaches, jungles, and volcanic terrain. But by the end of the campaign, the United States controlled the islands, and with them, a direct path to the skies over Japan. Soon, engineers would begin constructing enormous airfields capable of launching hundreds of B-29 bombers at once. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan was about to enter a completely new phase. By late 1944, the capture of the Mariana Islands changed the entire strategic geography of the Pacific War. For the first time, the Japanese home islands were within reliable range of American heavy bombers. The battles that secured these islands had been among the fiercest of the war. The invasion of Saipan in June 1944 alone cost thousands of lives on both sides. Japanese defenders fought to the last, and many civilians were caught in the chaos of the fighting. But by July, American forces had secured the island. Soon after, the nearby islands of Tinian and Guam also fell under American control. What followed was one of the largest military construction efforts of the entire war. Thousands of engineers from the United States Navy Seabees and the United States Army Corps of Engineers began transforming the islands into vast air bases. Dense jungle was cleared. Coral rock was crushed and flattened into runways. Entire networks of roads, fuel depots, ammunition bunkers, and maintenance hangars appeared almost overnight. On Tinian, construction crews built what would become the largest airfield complex in the world at the time. 6 enormous runways stretched across the island. Hundreds of bombers could be stationed there simultaneously. From these new bases, the long-range Boeing B-29 Superfortress could fly directly to the industrial heart of Japan. The distance from the Marianas to major Japanese cities such as Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka was roughly 1,500 miles. Long, but manageable for the Superfortress. By November 1944, the first major B-29 bombing missions began launching from the Marianas. At first, American commanders attempted high-altitude precision bombing, the same strategy being used in Europe against German factories. Bombers flew above 30,000 feet, aiming carefully at industrial targets like aircraft factories and steel plants. But Japan's geography and weather created major problems. Strong high-altitude winds, later identified as the powerful jet stream, pushed bombs far from their targets. Cloud cover often hid entire cities beneath thick layers of weather. Many early bombing missions scattered their bombs across wide areas with limited accuracy. The results frustrated American commanders. One officer in particular began questioning whether the strategy itself was flawed. That officer was LeMay. LeMay had already built a reputation in the European air war for strict discipline and aggressive tactics. When he arrived to command the 21 Bomber Command in the Marianas, he began studying the results of the early raids carefully. He noticed something important. Japanese cities were highly vulnerable to fire. Unlike many industrial cities in Europe, large sections of Japanese urban areas were built from wood and paper. Houses stood close together in crowded neighborhoods. Workshops and small factories were often located directly beside residential buildings. A single fire could spread rapidly. LeMay concluded that traditional precision bombing might never achieve the destruction American planners wanted. Instead, he proposed a radical change. Bomb the cities themselves, at low altitude, at night, using incendiary weapons designed to ignite massive fires. The new bombs were specifically engineered for this kind of warfare. Clusters of small incendiary devices would scatter across wide areas, igniting hundreds of fires at once. If enough fires started simultaneously, they could merge into a firestorm, an uncontrollable wall of flame fueled by entire neighborhoods of wooden buildings. It was a grim calculation. But by early 1945, the war had already become one of total destruction across much of the world. On the islands of the Pacific, battles like the Battle of Iwo Jima demonstrated how fiercely Japanese forces were willing to fight, even when defeat was certain. American leaders feared that an invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Strategic bombing, they believed, might break Japan's ability or willingness to continue the war. So preparations began. Bombers were stripped of heavy defensive guns to carry larger bomb loads. Crews were trained for nighttime navigation. New incendiary weapons were loaded by the thousands. Soon hundreds of B-29s would take off together from the runways of the Marianas. Their destination would be the crowded neighborhoods of Japan's largest cities. And when those bombers arrived over their targets, the nights for Japanese civilians would never feel the same again. For civilians across Japan, the bombing campaign was not experienced as a single catastrophic event. By 1945, the air raid sirens had become a familiar part of life in cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Most Japanese homes and urban neighborhoods were built from wood, bamboo, and paper walls. The narrow streets between them created dense communities where entire families lived only a few steps apart. These same qualities that once made the neighborhoods warm and communal also made them dangerously vulnerable to fire. As bombing raids increased, local authorities organized civil defense groups. Residents were trained to fight small fires with buckets of water or sand. Schools practiced evacuation drills. Children were sometimes sent to the countryside to stay with relatives far from the industrial cities. But even with these precautions, the psychological strain was enormous. Searchlights would sweep across the dark sky, while anti-aircraft guns fired upward into the clouds. Families gathered what little they could carry and moved toward shelters, many of which were simple reinforced basements or tunnels dug into hillsides. For many civilians, the waiting was the worst part. Sometimes the bombers passed without striking their neighborhood. Other times, explosions and fires erupted nearby, lighting the night sky orange. Entire districts could vanish within hours. Yet by morning, survivors often returned to the same routines. Streets were cleared. Rubble was pushed aside. Shops reopened if they still stood. The aircraft responsible for those nightly raids represented one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the Second World War. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was unlike any bomber that had come before it. Its wings stretched over 140 feet across. 4 powerful engines carried it higher and farther than most intercepting fighters could easily reach. Inside the aircraft were pressurized crew compartments, allowing airmen to operate at extreme altitudes without heavy oxygen gear. Perhaps the most unusual feature was its defensive system. Instead of manned gun turrets scattered across the aircraft, the B-29 used remotely controlled turrets linked to computerized aiming systems. Gunners could control multiple weapons from protected positions within the fuselage. From the bases in the Mariana Islands, the B-29 could travel thousands of miles across open ocean, reach Japan, deliver a heavy bomb load, and return. Each aircraft could carry more than 20,000 pounds of bombs. When hundreds of them flew together, the destructive potential was immense. Yet the bomber also came with serious challenges. The aircraft was complex and expensive. Early engines sometimes overheated or caught fire. Maintenance crews worked constantly on the island airfields to keep the bombers operational. Still, despite these difficulties, the B-29 gave American commanders something they had never possessed before: a reliable way to strike directly at the Japanese homeland. Japan was not defenseless against these raids, but its ability to stop them was limited. Both the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service attempted to intercept incoming bombers. Fighters such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 and the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate were deployed to defend the skies. But the B-29's altitude and speed made interception difficult. Many Japanese fighters struggled to climb high enough quickly enough to reach the bombers before they released their payloads. Others lacked heavy weapons capable of bringing down the large aircraft quickly. Anti-aircraft artillery provided some defense. Batteries of guns surrounded major cities and industrial facilities. Searchlights attempted to illuminate the bombers for targeting. Yet the scale of the raids overwhelmed these defenses. When hundreds of B-29s approached at once, even determined defenders could only intercept a fraction of them. Fuel shortages and pilot losses further weakened Japan's air defenses as the war dragged on. By 1945, the country's ability to mount effective large-scale interceptions had declined significantly. For the civilians below, the defensive guns in the sky offered some comfort, but the bombers still came through. And as the raids continued, both sides of the conflict began to recognize that something even more devastating was about to unfold. Inside the command centers of the United States Army Air Forces, the bombing campaign against Japan was not simply a military operation. It was also an intense strategic debate. For decades before the war, American air power theorists believed in the idea of precision bombing. The theory suggested that carefully targeted strikes against factories, rail yards, and industrial centers could cripple an enemy's ability to fight without destroying entire cities. Many Japanese industries were not concentrated inside massive factory complexes. Instead, production was scattered through thousands of small workshops located inside residential neighborhoods. Families assembled aircraft components, electronics, and other materials inside small buildings that stood only a few steps from homes and schools. Precision bombing against isolated factories would not disrupt this decentralized system effectively. General Curtis LeMay studied the early bombing results carefully after taking command of the 21 Bomber Command in early 1945. The high-altitude bombing strategy was failing. Clouds covered targets too often. The powerful jet stream winds over Japan pushed bombs far from their intended aim points. Even when bombers reached their targets, the results were inconsistent. LeMay concluded that the campaign needed a radical shift. Instead of flying high during the day, bombers would fly low at night. Instead of precision bombs, they would carry large quantities of incendiary weapons. But within the brutal logic of total war, American planners believed it could shorten the conflict and reduce the need for a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland. American scientists and engineers developed specialized incendiary bombs designed to spread flames rapidly through urban environments. One of the most common was the M69 incendiary device, a small napalm-filled bomb packed into large clusters. When dropped from bombers, these clusters would open in mid-air. Dozens of small incendiary bombs scattered across neighborhoods, piercing rooftops before igniting intense fires. Napalm burned at extremely high temperatures and clung to surfaces, making it difficult to extinguish. If enough of these devices landed close together, the fires could merge into massive infernos. In cities where most structures were built from wood, paper, and bamboo, the results could be catastrophic. Wind played a crucial role. When fires spread across multiple city blocks, they could create powerful drafts that pulled oxygen toward the flames. This sometimes generated a firestorm, an uncontrollable phenomenon, where hurricane-force winds fed a massive wall of fire. Entire neighborhoods could burn within hours. For the bomber crews flying overhead, the results could be visible from miles away. Some pilots later described seeing vast glowing circles of fire spreading across cities beneath them. The repeated bombing raids created a powerful psychological effect across Japanese cities. For many civilians, the greatest fear was no longer the bombs themselves. It was the anticipation, the knowledge that the bombers would return. Night after night, residents of cities like Tokyo, Kobe, and Yokohama began living according to the rhythms of the air raid sirens. Families slept lightly, often keeping emergency bags prepared near the door. Children learned to recognize the distant sound of aircraft engines before the sirens even began. Schools closed or moved to rural areas. Factories relocated operations where possible. Government propaganda attempted to reassure citizens that Japan would continue resisting the bombing campaign. But the destruction was becoming impossible to ignore. Each raid left new scars across the urban landscape. Burned districts, collapsed homes, and entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Even when the bombers targeted one city, residents of nearby regions could sometimes see the glow of the fires on the horizon. It was a reminder that the war was no longer confined to distant battlefields. It had arrived directly over Japan's largest cities. And soon, one particular night would demonstrate just how devastating the new bombing strategy could be. A night when hundreds of bombers approached a single city with a plan designed to ignite the largest urban fire in history. That city was Tokyo. And the raid would soon become known as the Bombing of Tokyo, March 9th to 10th, 1945. March 9th, 1945. Late in the afternoon, across the runways of the Mariana Islands, hundreds of ground crews moved with quiet efficiency around rows of waiting bombers. At massive airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the long silver shapes of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress stretched across the tarmac. Each aircraft was being prepared for something different from previous raids. Instead of the usual mix of high-explosive bombs, the bomb bays were filled almost entirely with incendiary weapons. Thousands of small M69 napalm bombs were packed into large cluster containers. When released over a target, these clusters would scatter hundreds of incendiaries across entire neighborhoods. The plan had been designed under the command of Curtis LeMay. LeMay believed that Japanese cities, with their dense wooden construction, were uniquely vulnerable to fire. If enough incendiary bombs landed across a wide area at once, the resulting fires might merge into a massive firestorm. It was a grim calculation, but American planners believed the strategy might cripple Japan's industrial production and weaken the nation's ability to continue the war. That evening, the bombers began taking off. One by one, the giant aircraft roared down the coral runways and lifted into the fading Pacific sky. The mission would eventually involve more than 300 B-29s, making it one of the largest bombing operations ever launched in the Pacific. Unlike earlier raids, the aircraft flew at much lower altitudes, often around 5,000 to 8,000 feet. Flying lower increased the accuracy of the incendiary weapons. It also reduced fuel consumption, allowing bombers to carry even heavier payloads. The crews understood the risk. Flying lower meant they were more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception. But intelligence reports suggested Japan's night defenses were limited. As the bombers formed into long streams across the dark ocean, they headed north toward their target. That target was the densely populated eastern districts of Tokyo. The chosen area was filled with small homes, workshops, and narrow streets. It was exactly the type of environment where incendiary bombing could spread quickly. The first Pathfinder aircraft arrived shortly after midnight on March 10th. These lead bombers carried special markers designed to ignite and outline the target zone. When the markers fell, flames began appearing across several blocks of the city. From above, the first fires looked small, but they were only the beginning. Within minutes, wave after wave of incoming bombers began releasing their incendiary clusters. The bombs burst open in the air, scattering hundreds of burning devices across rooftops, streets, and buildings. Fires ignited across dozens of neighborhoods at once. Wooden houses began burning almost immediately. Wind pushed the flames from building to building. Entire rows of homes caught fire within minutes. For bomber crews looking down from the dark sky, the city began glowing with hundreds of separate fires. But on the ground, the situation was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. The fires were spreading faster than anyone had predicted. And the night over Tokyo was about to turn into one of the most destructive urban disasters in human history. Shortly after midnight on March 10, 1945, the eastern districts of Tokyo were already burning in dozens of places at once. But the bombing had only just begun. More and more aircraft from the approaching stream of Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers began arriving over the city. Flying at low altitude, they released their incendiary clusters across a carefully mapped grid. Each wave expanded the growing ring of fires. Within a short time, thousands of individual blazes were burning simultaneously across residential neighborhoods. Wooden houses ignited almost instantly as napalm-filled incendiary bombs punched through rooftops and exploded into intense flames. The narrow streets that once connected these neighborhoods now trapped heat and smoke between closely packed buildings. Firefighters and civil defense volunteers attempted to contain the flames. Residents formed bucket brigades, throwing water and sand onto burning roofs. But the scale of the fires quickly overwhelmed any organized response. Strong winds began feeding the flames. As multiple fires merged together, they started creating powerful drafts of their own. Hot air rising from the burning districts pulled fresh oxygen inward, accelerating the spread of the inferno. Soon, entire blocks were engulfed. The phenomenon that American planners had predicted was beginning to form, a firestorm. Winds intensified dramatically, sometimes reaching speeds strong enough to knock people off their feet. The fire consumed everything combustible in its path: homes, shops, warehouses, and factories built within residential areas. Temperatures in some sections rose so high that metal structures began to warp. For civilians trying to escape, the streets became nearly impossible to navigate. Smoke thickened the air. Sparks and burning debris fell from the sky as entire rows of buildings collapsed. Many residents attempted to flee toward rivers and canals that cut through the city. Thousands crowded along the banks of waterways like the Sumida River, hoping the water might offer protection from the advancing flames. But even there, the heat remained intense. Witnesses later described scenes of chaos and desperation as families searched for escape routes through streets already blocked by fire. Meanwhile, high above the city, bomber crews could see the scale of the destruction spreading beneath them. Pilots later recalled seeing a vast orange glow covering miles of the city. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the air, visible even to aircraft still approaching from far behind. Some aircrews reported turbulence caused by the rising heat from the massive fires below. By the time the final bombers completed their runs and turned back toward the Pacific, large sections of eastern Tokyo had been transformed into a single burning landscape. The raid had lasted only a few hours. But by dawn, the devastation was immense. Roughly 16 square miles of the city lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash. Historians estimate that more than 80,000 people were killed during the night of the bombing of Tokyo, March 9th to 10th, 1945, making it one of the deadliest air raids in history. For many survivors, the morning light revealed a city that no longer resembled the one they had known just hours before. But for the commanders directing the bombing campaign, the raid represented something else. Proof that the new strategy of incendiary warfare could devastate Japan's urban centers. And it meant that the bombers would return again and again and again. In the days following the devastating firestorm in Tokyo, the leadership of the United States Army Air Forces carefully analyzed the results. The conclusions were clear. The incendiary strategy had produced destruction on a scale far greater than previous high-altitude precision raids. Entire districts of the city had been burned within hours, crippling workshops, warehouses, and small industries scattered through residential neighborhoods. For commanders like LeMay, the results confirmed that the bombing campaign could expand dramatically. And so the raids continued. Throughout the spring and summer of 1945, waves of Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers launched from the massive airfields in the Mariana Islands. Their targets now included many of Japan's largest urban and industrial centers. One by one, cities began experiencing similar nights of fire. In March 1945, large portions of Nagoya were heavily damaged by incendiary raids, targeting aircraft production facilities and surrounding neighborhoods. The following months brought additional strikes against Osaka, a major industrial and commercial hub, where factories and residential districts alike suffered extensive destruction. The port city of Kobe also endured repeated bombing raids that destroyed large areas of its urban center. Each attack followed a similar pattern. Bomber formations arrived at night. Pathfinder aircraft marked target zones. Waves of incendiary bombs ignited hundreds of fires that rapidly spread through wooden buildings and crowded neighborhoods. The cumulative damage across Japan's cities was staggering. Industrial production declined sharply as factories burned or lost their workforce. Rail lines and transportation systems struggled to operate under constant threat of air attack. Millions of civilians were displaced as homes and neighborhoods disappeared under fire. For ordinary people across Japan, the war had become an experience of constant uncertainty. Families packed emergency supplies near their doors. Some residents began sleeping fully clothed, ready to run for shelters when the sirens sounded. Children who once attended school in crowded city classrooms were increasingly evacuated to rural villages far from likely bombing targets. Government officials attempted to maintain public morale through radio broadcasts and newspaper reports emphasizing resilience and sacrifice. But the physical destruction spreading across the country was becoming impossible to hide. Even cities that had not yet been bombed could sometimes see the glow of fires from distant raids lighting the night sky on the horizon. For Japan's military leadership, the situation posed a growing dilemma. Air defenses were stretched thin. Fuel shortages limited fighter operations. Radar coverage remained limited compared to the massive number of incoming bombers. Meanwhile, the American air campaign continued expanding. By the middle of 1945, dozens of Japanese cities had experienced major air raids. Some had been struck repeatedly, leaving large areas burned or abandoned. Yet despite the devastation, Japan had not surrendered. Its government and military leadership continued preparing for the possibility of invasion, while encouraging civilians to endure the bombing campaign. But as the summer approached, the relentless destruction from the air was only one part of the growing pressure facing the nation. Other events were also unfolding that would soon bring the war closer to its final conclusion. By mid-1945, the repeated B-29 incendiary raids had transformed Japan's cities into landscapes of devastation. Tokyo, Osaka, Nago, Kobe, and countless smaller urban centers bore the marks of firestorms. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash, and tens of thousands of civilians had perished. Millions more were displaced, wandering through streets of rubble, searching for shelter, water, and food. Industrial production collapsed. Factories that once produced aircraft, munitions, and equipment were destroyed. Transportation networks lay in ruins. Rail lines, highways, and bridges, essential for moving supplies and troops, were either burned or severely damaged. Even where machinery survived, the workforce had been scattered, evacuated, or killed. The Japanese military, already strained from years of fighting across the Pacific, struggled to respond. Fighter aircraft were increasingly scarce, fuel shortages worsened, and the defense of cities became a near impossible task. Anti-aircraft batteries, scattered and underpowered, could only slow the inevitable. For civilians, The nightly hum of approaching bombers became a relentless rhythm. Families who had survived one raid were often caught in the next, living in constant fear. Cities emptied as millions fled to the countryside, yet the network of fires and destruction left few areas truly safe. By July 1945, the cumulative effect of the incendiary raids, combined with other military pressures, brought Japan to the brink. American planners recognized the psychological and logistical toll the bombing campaign had inflicted. The relentless nightly raids had weakened not only the industrial capacity of the nation, but also its will to continue the war. In early August 1945, Japan faced the ultimate escalation. The first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, followed days later by the second on Nagasaki. By then, much of the country had already endured months of destruction and terror from conventional bombing raids. The nightly threat from B-29 bombers had normalized fear, conditioned the population to constant evacuation, and left the infrastructure of the cities in ruins, making the impact of the atomic strikes even more decisive. The combination of strategic firebombing and nuclear attacks forced the Japanese government to confront the reality of inevitable defeat. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced surrender, ending World War II. The sound of engines that had haunted Japanese cities for months finally faded. The streets, though quiet, carried the scars of relentless destruction. Families returned to burned neighborhoods. Survivors counted their losses. Cities would take years, even decades, to rebuild. The firebombing campaign, and the nightly terror it brought, had achieved its strategic objective. The war had reached deep into the daily lives of ordinary people, transforming both the physical and psychological landscape of Japan. Yet, while the destruction was immense, it also raised enduring questions about the nature of total war, the ethics of strategic bombing, and the price civilians pay in modern conflict. The echoes of those nights, filled with the constant drone of B-29 engines, would linger in the memory of a nation long after the war ended. The nights when B-29 bombers darkened the skies over Japan left an indelible mark on the cities, on the people, and on the way warfare would be understood forever. Entire neighborhoods of wood and paper, homes filled with families, schools, shops, and workshops were reduced to ash within hours. The fires were not merely physical. They burned a sense of safety, transforming the night into a persistent landscape of fear. From the perspective of American planners, the campaign demonstrated the devastating potential of strategic air power. The combination of technological innovation, precise planning, and relentless execution had brought the war directly into the heart of Japan, achieving what naval battles and island campaigns alone could not. The B-29 Superfortress, a symbol of modern engineering, had carried the conflict across thousands of miles of ocean to reshape the lives of millions. Yet the human cost was staggering. Civilians, caught in a war not of their making, lived under constant terror. Families fled through streets of smoke and flame, sometimes losing everything they owned. Communities that had thrived for decades vanished in a single night. The firebombing campaign forced an entire nation to endure the unrelenting reality of modern total war, where no city could be considered safe. In a broader sense, these raids reshaped the ethics and strategy of warfare. They illustrated the devastating efficiency of aerial bombardment and the psychological as well as physical consequences of targeting urban populations. They forced planners, soldiers, and civilians alike to confront the difficult question: how far could technology and strategy extend the reach of war? Decades later, survivors of those nights remember the sound of engines, the glow of firestorms on the horizon, and the sense that nothing would ever be the same. The memories endure not only as a testament to suffering, but also as a reminder of the power of strategic planning, human resilience, and the profound consequences of war. In the end, the B-29s returning night after night were more than aircraft. They were a symbol of an era in which the sky itself had become a battlefield, and where civilians learned that, in total war, No home was beyond its reach.